Okay, so what are we talking about today? What was the article about today that I had you read? Yeah.
The article was why transgender athletes must not compete against biological females.
Okay, so what kinds of transgender athletes specifically?
Trans women.
Right, trans women. Now, this article was written by a former Olympic swimmer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, Nancy Hogshead-Makar. And this is just a small, it's not even like an academic article. It's more of an opinion piece that she wrote. But I thought this would be an interesting topic to discuss because this is an issue that is becoming, a lot more people are talking about this now. And so it raises important ethical questions, I think, about why we do sports, what the point of sports is, and important ethical questions about how do we accommodate people who identify differently than us. Now, y'all voted on it, so in some sense, y'all wanted to talk about it. I don't want to dominate the discussion today. I'm hoping that I actually hear what y'all's opinions are. But let me just kind of set the stage for you. So, as I said before, the woman who wrote this article was a former U.S. Olympic swimmer. And in her life, she has had to deal with other Olympic members she was competing against having an unfair advantage over her. I believe she gave an interview or participated in an interview with The Economist in which she lays this out more thoroughly. In the 70s and 80s, women's Olympic swimming was dominated by Eastern Europeans and Germans, more specifically. And it was discovered that a lot of these women were taking testosterone, and they weren't being screened out for it. And so they were just dominating all of the other Olympic athletes in these swimming events. And the author today had a real problem with that because she wasn't using any steroids. She wasn't taking any testosterone. And she thought that testosterone was giving these women an unfair advantage that they shouldn't have otherwise, especially in Olympic swimming. So, not only has this woman been an Olympic swimmer herself and competed against what she thought was unfair advantages that other people had, but she's also, I believe, involved in championing women's rights. So she's also looking at this not only from the sports angle, but also from the legal angle, which is why I think her opinion is kind of interesting here. Now, it's clear from the piece that her goal really is just to basically give her view on this issue of transgender women competing in women's sports. Now, why are we talking about this issue at all? Why is it even an issue? What kind of argument is she making in this piece about why she does not support what she calls biological males competing in women's sports? What's her argument?
They have advantages.
What kinds of advantages?
Like physical.
Physical advantages, right? That's her argument. She thinks that trans women who are biologically male have physical advantages in sports that are unfair for biological females to compete against. Now already, we need to make a distinction. Because if we don't make this distinction, the conversation is going to become messy and it's going to become difficult to navigate. Contemporary gender studies posits that there is a distinction between sex and gender, right? What is this distinction? What is the difference between sex and gender, if there is any at all? I'm a male, but I'm also a man, right? What makes me a male and what makes me a man? Anybody? Unless y'all don't believe there's a difference between sex and gender.
One's what you identify as and one is what you were born with.
Okay. So, what do you mean by born with? Could you say more about that?
Or biologically, you're a male.
Biologically. Okay, so sex has to do with some sort of biological characteristic or set of characteristics that someone has. Is that the general view? What is gender then? If sex is biological. You said identify as. I identify as a man. What does that mean?
A lot of people, or some people, aren't really comfortable with what they're born with, I guess, so they identify as something else. Or with trans women, they're born a male, but they identify as women.
Right, they identify as women. If we're going to say sex is biological, we might say that gender has to do with the social. Is that something people are comfortable with? Or that makes sense? There's a long history of the study and the distinctions between sex and gender within the last 50 years. But generally it comes down to this distinction. Sex is something that is biological. It has something to do with your sex characteristics, genitalia, chromosomes, hormones. There are even differences in male and female brains, slight differences. Males conceptualize objects in 3D space better. Female brains do other things that are better than men on average, than males on average. But generally, the distinction today seems to be that sex and gender are not the same thing. You can have a certain sex or be a member of a certain sex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your gender lines up with that in the heteronormative way that we're used to speaking about these things, or in the binary way that we're used to speaking about these things. So this phrase, trans women who are biologically male have physical advantages in sports that unfairly disadvantage biological females. What the author is trying to say here is that people who are born or assigned the sex of male at birth, but later end up identifying as women, she thinks that they have an unfair physical advantage over cis women, women who are born female and who identify as women. Does that make sense, what she's trying to say here? Now, before we get into what Makar actually has to say and what her analysis is and the evidence that she provides and the argumentation that she provides for her claim, let me just put the question to all of you. Do you think she's right? When it comes to sports, let's say somebody is male, they're born a male, they end up going through puberty, and then they end up transitioning to a woman later in life. Do they have physical advantages that cis women do not have? if they were to compete physically or in a sport.
I think once you said that they went through puberty already, like, yeah, like, once you get through puberty as a man, like, you develop, like, more muscle than you would as a woman. I think that, I'm not sure about, like, what actually happens, but, like, I think that, like, before puberty, like, before they start to develop, if they, like, get on, like, hormones or whatever, then, like, I think that it's different then. Like, I think that, like, they didn't go through, like, they didn't go through, like, male puberty to, like, get, you know, bigger, stronger, whatever it is.
So the way that I framed the question, you would say yes.
Yeah, because you said that he already went through puberty.
Got it. What if we had somebody who was born a male and they were put on hormone blockers and then they did go through hormone replacement therapy before puberty? Do you think they would have any physical advantages over a cis woman? Are y'all familiar with this term cis? What does it mean? Can somebody just say it for the class?
Your gender matches up with your sex.
Right. Right. The gender that you identify as or the gender that you perform. Judith Butler has famously said that gender is something of a performance. Not as if you're like faking it, but like it's something that you're doing out there in the world. It's embodied in your mannerisms and how you engage with people socially. Cis is supposed to denote that the gender that you identify as or perform matches up with the sex that you were assigned at birth. Yes?
So now if I like say what and instead of saying I'm a male, because like it's like a man and female, I just say I'm a cis.
I suppose if you were going to use this terminology.
So I'm not a cis to some people, not a man.
Well, you'd be, they would say you're a cis man.
Cis man.
Yeah. This terminology can be helpful to help differentiate between different kinds of gender and sexual identities, but I'm not forcing you to adopt it, right? So her basic argument is that not that trans women shouldn't be able to compete in women's sports in principle, but she thinks that if it can be shown that trans women do not have an unfair physical advantage over cis women, if that can't be shown, then they shouldn't be allowed to compete in the same sporting events. So she's not trying to say that no trans women can compete against biological, let's say, females in principle, but it all turns on whether there's a physical advantage there or not. And one important consideration is puberty, which we've mentioned. Now, her analysis centers around one particular trans athlete that she discusses in this piece. Which trans athlete does she discuss here?
Leah Thomas.
Who is Leah Thomas?
She is a swimmer at UPenn University, I think it was.
Yeah, was she at Pitt?
I think it was UPenn, I'm not sure.
I can't remember. It was, one of those schools, right? But yeah, so her analysis and argument centers around this particular trans athlete. And she just uses this trans athlete not as an example, not because she's trying to go after her or target her or anything like that. And she uses Leah Thomas as an example because she thinks that she provides something like an archetypal case of what is happening to a lot of cis women in women's sports. So Leah Thomas was born a male, and at first, they did compete in men's swimming. It wasn't until, I believe, their junior year that they started going on different hormones and transitioning physically. Then they switched over to women's swimming. And what does she say about Leah Thomas's performance between when they competed as a man versus as a woman? Does anybody remember? Yeah.
I think when she competed, there was like a 11% difference in like the time between her and other women.
Right. So she ends up breaking it down statistically, comparing men's and women's swimming speeds. But when Leah Thomas was competing as a man, they didn't do particularly well. But then when they began their transition into being a woman and started competing in women's swimming competitions, Leah Thomas started dominating. And one of Makar's central arguments here is that there's something unfair that's going on here. She wants to make the broad claim that Thomas's inclusion in women's swimming was not fair for the other women that were competing in these events. And her argument centers around the claim that Thomas's biologically male body gave her unfair physical advantages against the other biological women that she was competing against. Now, in order for her argument to be convincing, what do we have to show or determine? What does this argument depend on? It's not hard. It may seem like I'm giving you a trick question. It's not a trick question.
That there is an advantage.
Say more about that. Yeah, you're on the right track.
You have to be able to prove that there is a physical advantage by like them competing.
Right. Right. It all comes down to whether or not biological males and biological females do possess different physical characteristics. Whether or not biological males are usually stronger or faster or present some sort of physical advantage over biological women in physical events. So what do we think about that? Are there no differences between males and females' bodies when it comes to physical competition? Okay, say more. What kind of differences are there, if there are any? You said muscle tissue? What else did you say? Sorry, what else?
Genetics, really.
What would genetics have to do with it?
Just like more strong, in a sense. So it's more testosterone,
Okay, and what does testosterone do?
aggression,
Aggression? Okay, what does that have to do with somebody being stronger or faster, though?
more violent.
More violent? Yeah, I mean, maybe.
Somebody has less strength, less speed, somebody could get hurt.
Are there differences between male and female bodies when it comes to physical characteristics? In general? There are differences in general, right? But now let's talk about sports specifically. What does testosterone end up doing for the male body? Does anybody know? I know there are some health science people in here, right?
Testosterone technically makes you stronger. Like the hormone pushes the male body to progress faster and make more muscle and make more power in their body and make them grow. Female hormones tend to slow that. It kind of stunts your growth. It doesn't promote muscle growth or anything.
Okay, so testosterone is important in the production of muscle and muscle fibers, we might say. Are there any other differences?
It also helps with fat distribution.
Fat distribution, why is that important?
Men just usually have a better physique than women do.
What do you mean by better?
I mean, they can, you don't see a woman, usually, chiseled with a six-pack and, biceps huge and everything. I don't know.
No, I know what you mean. I just wanted to get from the better to the, there's more physicalness there. I don't know how you would say it. One thing that researchers have noted is that testosterone also influences bone density. Have y'all heard this? The bone density between males and females is different. And there is perhaps at least one more key difference. It has to do with blood.
The production of red blood cells.
Right, so what does that do? What do red blood cells do?
Deliver oxygen.
They deliver oxygen throughout the body. Right. Increased capacity for oxygenation. Now, it has been, I think, shown in the scientific literature that testosterone has these kinds of effects. The question that we're really trying to answer, well, I guess is twofold. One, how does puberty change someone physically when we look at the male and the female body? And then secondly, what does that information have to say about trans women's inclusion in women's sports? Now, Makar is going to say that Thomas's biologically male body, because she went through puberty as a male, ended up producing a certain body for her that has physical advantages over a normal female body. But this is one tiny aspect of why Makar thinks that trans women should not be allowed to compete against biological women unless it can be shown that they don't have these physical advantages. One of her primary claims is that allowing trans women to compete with biological women is unethical because it deprives biological women of certain opportunities that they might otherwise have for scholarships, for jobs, for certain career paths. I was doing some research this morning, and I heard that, at least in 2022, there have been 85 instances in which a biological woman has lost a spot to compete in a certain event or lost a scholarship to a trans woman. Now, obviously, this claim is somewhat separate from the one above it, but they are related. So maybe we'll start with the first one. First of all, do we think that the male body is more suited to compete more highly in physical competition? Do male bodies have some sort of physical advantage over female bodies when it comes to physical events? Does it depend on the event? Does it depend on the sport? What do y'all think? Let's take a stark example. Let's talk about the Olympic deadlifting record. Are men and women competing at the same level and lifting the same weights? Okay, no. Do you know what the weight difference is? I think generally it's a 400-pound difference. Does it seem like males have a physical advantage in deadlifting based on that statistic? How about in another sport? What about tennis? Serving power? Okay. So does that provide males an advantage? Bless you. Okay. Do y'all agree with that? Or is there anybody who disagrees?
I just wanted to add that there are regulations for testosterone in transgender women for sports, and it has to be below 10 something that I can't understand for at least 12 months prior to and during competition.
Yep.
And that's in Olympics. So technically, they're going to be monitored at the same levels. So can we even use that as an argument if testosterone is even?
That's a good question, yeah. We're going to get there. Keep that point in mind because we're going to get there. When we look at males and females competing in their respective sports, do they compete at the same level generally? If not, what does that say or what should that say about the topic that we're discussing today? Does it change if the trans person doesn't go through puberty as a male? Wouldn't that mitigate perhaps the physical differences? If you have like an 11-year-old boy, and he wants to become a woman, and he's put on hormone blockers and then hormone replacement therapy, and doesn't go through puberty normally as a male. I mean, it's been done, yeah. I don't know exactly what, the... Say that again? Yeah, we would have to, I don't know exactly what the data looks like and how the body changes or what it would be like compared to if a male normally went through puberty and didn't transition, but maybe that might perhaps negate the physical differences.
Well, I think about it like, I've been
before, like, you know, not even considering, like, trans people and everything, like, kids play soccer together, you know, female and male, because their physical differences are not different before the age of, like, I think it's like 11 or 12. Like, then people start going through, you know, puberty, and it changes, and, you know, boys get stronger, boys get faster. So, like, I think there's 100% a difference between transitioning when you're 18 versus transitioning when you're 11. But with that being said, when you're 18 and you transition, your body goes through puberty again. So, like, you lose all of that. Like, you lose, like, the muscle mass. You lose, like, that fat distribution. Like, that all changes your body once you start to go in those hormones.
How long does it take?
I think the rule is, like, 2.5 years. So, like, Leah Thomas, like, she competed as a male because she had to be on the hormones for 2.5 years before she could compete. And I don't think the NCAA came up with that rule, like, out of thin air. Like, I'm pretty sure they, like, consulted doctors and, like, talked to them. They said after 2.5 years, there's, like, a rule that states, like, they no longer really have the biological stances of a man anymore.
Okay, so you're saying 2.5 years, but what was the source that you cited for? And they need to be, off testosterone for 12 months?
Oh, off testosterone.
Or what was it that you read? I don't remember the exact claim that you made.
It said something about, like, transitioning. It was like you have to wait 12 months before switching over, and her
Leah, yeah.
she was transitioned for 30 months.
30. Okay. Got it. Yeah, okay. So you're saying that if you do go through the transition later in life, you negate all of the physical advantages that you would have had, or that you had from going through puberty as a male?
Your body, like, loses that. You know, you don't stay as strong. And if you even look at pictures of Leah, like, you can tell she lost, like, a lot of muscle mass. She lost, like, a lot. Like, her physique did change a lot.
There's a difference, however, between someone's physique changing and all of the differences being negated, right? So I definitely buy that someone's physique changes once they transition. But does that completely change their muscle mass, bone density, blood oxygen levels?
She's still, like, dominated everyone else. Like, her numbers were above whatever, like, the record or whatever it was, even though her physique changed. So her physique changing was kind of irrelevant to the result.
So perhaps that's a piece of evidence in support of the idea that the physical advantages, through that transition period are not completely mitigated. What do y'all think?
This article about trans people in sports says, and I quote, "Many hormone-related physical characteristics acquired during puberty are not reversed if hormone levels are changed later in life. By contrast, muscle mass, fat distribution, and red blood cell count are among the physical characteristics that relate to an individual's current testosterone levels." So
Okay.
it's saying, like, muscle mass, fat distribution, and red blood cell count are directly related to your current, like, level of testosterone, but other physical characteristics are not reversed.
Okay, so what might those be?
Bone density, I'm assuming.
Maybe bone density. I don't know what else is on the list of, what changes when you go through puberty. Skeletal shape? Is that different between males and females? Like, yeah, don't generally females have a wider pelvis? So the question seems to really turn on whether or not trans women have some sort of unfair biological advantage, right, over cis women. Now, Makar thinks that they do. And she cites some statistics for this on pages 3 and 4. So at the bottom of page 3, she says, Thomas proved that the advocates who assured the NCAA and their member schools that male puberty could be rolled back in a single year after consistent hormone treatment were wrong. The rules should follow the evidence, and in this case it is clear. Thomas should not have been in head-to-head competition with biological females. 2020 research on transgender women athletes by Emma Hilton and Tommy Lundberg concluded that, quote, the biological advantage, most notably in terms of muscle mass and strength, conferred by male puberty and thus enjoyed by most transgender women is only minimally reduced when testosterone is suppressed, as per current sporting guidelines for transgender athletes. Thomas qualified and could have competed in the men's category, or could have completed in an exhibition race where her results would not count until the evidence and science catches up with sports practices. In all my years competing with East German women who were doped to the gills, they were only slightly better than the best biological women. Not one of them were competitive with men. Moreover, if I had tested positive for testosterone, I probably would have suffered a 4-year suspension from international competition. But if I tested positive twice, I'd be banned for life. Because the World Anti-Doping Agency knows that long-term testosterone use produces legacy effects that last much longer than just during the time it is used. So, Makar seems to be saying here that even if we, per current sporting guidelines for transgender athletes, even if we allow them a year time before they start competing in the women's category, they still have unfair biological advantages. But you might ask if this is even a problem. Is it a problem? Why should we care about it? Don't we want to be inclusive to trans people? What do y'all think?
I mean, yeah, you want to be inclusive, but at the same time, like what Makar said, you're taking away from like some females that have practiced their whole life, like in this instance, to make the NCAA swimming championships or whatever, and like people missed out on that because this person was competing at an unfair advantage. Like that's not fair to those people at all.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here. Look, we all have different advantages and disadvantages in here. The men have some advantages compared to the other men, right? Genetic, biological. Some men in here are faster and stronger than some other men in here. But we don't see that as a problem, right?
They're both men, both can get stronger, they can get faster. Same as just cis women, when they can get stronger, they can get faster, but then if you put a male in there, it's just unfair. It makes no sense. It's just, I don't even know why people argue about it. It's unfair.
Okay, so you're saying there's something different about allowing a biological male to compete with a cis woman than, one man who is physically different than another man competing.
I'm not gonna lie, you're confusing me with the women, the cis, the confusing me. What?
I'm just saying, you're pointing out there's a difference between the Leah Thomas case and men competing against one another.
Yes. I mean, man, he turned into a female, right?
Sorry, say that again?
He was male and he turned into a female, correct?
Yeah, he's transitioning into being a female.
We've all talked about it. Biologically, it's unfair. It's an unfair advantage. If you stay a man and then became better, then you would actually be okay. Yeah, you're good at it. But instead, you took the adoption. I'm just gonna go compete with women. You turn to a woman and you go.
Okay. Do y'all agree with that? Is it unfair, even if there is some sort of biological difference?
Well, I do see it, she has more, bone density because she went through, male puberty and everything. But also, in another regard, it's people say that she transitioned because she wanted to win. But that's not, an accurate thing. Who would change their gender just to win a trophy, just to win a title? That's not accurate. She was 18 years old and she had the courage to speak out and say that she was transgender. That takes a lot in itself. And people are completely stripping her of everything that she's done, everything that she's won, and everything that she's stood for as an athlete. So I understand the biological change that she went through, but she's simply following the rule. NCAA says she can compete as a female. I think if there's any issues, it should be taken up with the NCAA. It
shouldn't be taken out on her.
Ah, okay. So she's following the rules that the NCAA put forth. Do we think the rules should be changed?
I think it's, I mean, regarding the rules, I'm not sure about that, but like, I think it's just the same as like, if it was a trans woman, like a woman that became a man, I don't think that there would be many men's sports teams that would want a trans woman on their team. Like, they wouldn't think that like, they wouldn't want that.
Why not?
Because they don't have the characteristics as men. Like, I feel like that's just something that you don't see very often. You don't see a lot of like, trans women in men's sports. Like, that's just not, I feel like that's not like seen very often.
Oh, you mean
Like,
someone who
that's,
transitions from a woman to a man
a
in
woman to a
men's
man.
sports?
Like, if you were to like reverse it, like both ways, I feel like it'd be unfair. It'd be unfair for the competition with the team if they had a male, and then like the men's team with the female would be at a disadvantage, I think, because like, yeah, women aren't as strong as men. Even
Okay.
if they go through like the testosterone stuff and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
So let's take a voice for it. Let's say she wins like wrestling or like MMA. That now as a man, or as a man turns a woman, could seriously injure somebody, a female, because they're stronger, denser, and we just talked about all the different things. Like someone could seriously get injured from that. So, and that should just your immediate, it's just like when you think about other sports, but she's talking about like football, right? Like somebody could
In contact sports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just say, like, first of all, I'm not gonna come out and say it's like wrong or anything, like that's your choice, you do that, like cool. But like if you wanna still compete, you're once male and you're a male, so I feel like it'd be bigger if she can still compete against the males.
Okay.
That's just my viewpoint. If you start competing, you've been competing against males, why don't you just keep competing against males? Why you just switch up just because it's your competitor? Like, you know what I mean? Like that's just
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So like with like the wrestling thing, there are girls who already wrestle against men, and it depends on the weight. So like, it wouldn't really matter if what gender they were, like it depends on the weight, and you work out so you gain that muscle mass. And I mean, I don't think they technically will get hurt. I mean, they are coming in close to that position because they want to wrestle, no matter what gender they are.
Okay, so at least in wrestling, it's broken down by weight class, right? So it's stratified in that way. Yeah.
If we can break it down like into weight class for like wrestling, could we break it down in other sports like times basically? Like if you can compete no matter what gender or sex you are, like at a certain time, then you should be able to compete in that level.
Why not? What do you think? Or if you want to say something differently, that's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I am a wrestler, and I know, like, it was a couple of years ago, there was a big case in Texas because a transgender man, like, transitioning to a woman, wrestled at the women's state wrestling tournament in Texas.
Okay.
And absolutely dominated, and everyone was saying that, like, it wasn't fair. And even though they're in the same weight class and everything, like, this person was wrestling since they were young, and now they're 18 and they're competing against females, and they just had an unfair advantage, and just wasn't fair at all.
Okay, so maybe breaking it down by weight class isn't going to be sufficient to fix the issue if there's an issue here?
And like with wrestling, you can see it like whenever you're young, like whenever there's women or girls wrestling against boys when they're 8, 10 years old, there's no advantage there. Like I've personally seen a girl make the state finals when she was 12 years old against boys because the boys hadn't hit puberty yet. There wasn't any physical advantages one way or another. But then you see when girls get up into high school, they don't seem to compete as well against the men because the men have now gone through puberty. And through that, there's been a big push for like women's wrestling. So now there's like women's wrestling has their own teams, and I know like a bunch of states have sanctioned it, and they have their own like state tournaments and everything. So now the women aren't competing against the men like when they get to like the high school level.
Okay.
Or in college.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
I think it's, for one, like, a man at 160 pounds is stronger than a woman at 160 pounds, just based off of genetics and stuff. Like, if you look up the lifting record
Okay. Yeah.
I don't understand how, like, there's not more science on it. You know, like, if this is such a giant issue that everybody knows about and it's a constant thought in people's minds, then where's more science? Like, all I can find is like, these are the changes that happens, these are the ones that don't, this is based on current level. Like, I just wish there was more.
Well, has this ever been an issue in the past for humans?
Yeah, they, like, Leia's not the first transgender person to compete in the Olympics. Like, there's others, and they're, let me.
It may be that, this discussion is becoming more prevalent because trans women competing in women's sports is becoming more common, right?
Well, have they thought about yet, like, making, like, a transgender category instead to maybe?
What do you think about that? Should we add a new category?
So I'm a cis woman, so I can't talk about transgender issues. I don't want to speak over trans voices or trans people in general, but like, I've had a trans friend and we did bring that up as a conversation, and she said that she would feel like it would be too, I feel like it would like, it invalidates her feelings as a woman. She wants to be seen as a woman, not as a trans woman, but as a woman. So I feel like maybe certain trans people would be okay with that, but there's certain trans people that wouldn't be okay with that because they want to be seen as what they're identifying as, which is a woman or a man.
Okay. So the creation of a transgender athlete category is like exclusive kind of in and of itself, is what they were saying. Now that's an interesting point because another claim that Makar makes in this piece is Thomas's inclusion in women's swimming does not actually help the trans cause. She thinks that it does not engender greater empathy for the trans community. What do you think about that? Do you think we are being inclusive and empathetic and caring by allowing trans women to compete with biological women? Or is there a sense in which, as Makar is arguing here, this practice that we're trying to be inclusive about is actually backfiring and it's causing people to look down or not have that much empathy for trans people? You think she's right? About like this inclusive practice that we're trying to engage in is causing actually people to not view trans people very highly, and maybe even. So it's in a sense she's saying this inclusive practice is actually counterproductive. It's not actually being inclusive.
Maybe they should be looking at the people judging so harshly, because like if you put a trans woman in the spotlight, people are going to pick out all the wrongs, just like women in magazines. Oh, she doesn't look like me, not good enough. Like there's judgment literally everywhere, and if you put somebody in the spotlight, everyone is looking at them. Everyone is picking out the differences. Everyone is giving their opinion. Maybe it's just an effect of being in the spotlight.
So you're like, maybe this is true, but like that's people's problems.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have issues that they need to work out. Maybe.
So it's like I'll say again, like you can't like I'm a cisgendered woman. For me, it's just like when it comes to the trans community, they have to have their own voice. They should be the ones to distinguish whether or not that is right or wrong, because they are the ones facing those problems, not cisgendered or like we are involved some way somehow, but at the same time, I feel like only the trans community can like say whether or not that it affects or it affects their community or makes them seem like in a better spotlight towards cisgendered or not cisgendered male or woman. I feel like only the trans community can make that distinguish.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that when like trans issues start affecting cis people, like in regards to the sports, like yeah, like if a male were to compete against a biological male, whatever cis male were to compete against a female, she could actually get hurt. And in that case, like I don't think that they should have the right to just make those decisions that they're like, oh, I want to be included in the gender that I think that I should be. I think that when it starts affecting other people other than like their community, like everyone else should have a say too.
Okay, so once it starts affecting other people, then more social groups should have a say on what the appropriate procedure is and what we should allow and not allow.
Absolutely.
I feel like we can use like Caitlyn Jenner as an example. Like my brother saw her in person. She's like massive, very broad. Like if she's competing against other biological women, I feel like they're gonna get destroyed. Like people like that are like just physically stronger, and I don't think it's fair. Like if I play soccer and like a biologically male came in and played soccer, like I feel like it wouldn't be fair in a sense. Like
Okay.
just go through everyone and get scored.
Okay, so let me summarize what Makar is saying so far, and then I'll get to you. So, her basic argument is that allowing trans people who have been born as males and gone through puberty in women's sports, there's something unfair about that. She's not saying that all trans people should not be allowed in women's sports. It depends on whether or not there's a physical advantage there or not. She says that the current rules, like the NCAA rules, for example, the current trans inclusive rules do not mitigate biological advantages. And to back this up, she discusses how male bodies are affected by puberty. Remember, this is kind of the subset that she's discussing here. So she says, science shows that trans women who are biologically male and went through puberty still possess physical advantages over cis women, even if they've been on hormone therapy for a year, let's say. Or even, let's say, 2.5 years. Even this transition does not fully change or mitigate the biological advantage, she thinks. But she doesn't just care about this because she thinks abstractly it's unfair. She cares about this issue because she thinks it is actually having real-world effects on biological females. She's saying that allowing trans women to compete causes females to lose out on educational and economic opportunities that they would have otherwise had. But I just want to remind you again, she's not against trans women competing in principle. She says that trans women should be allowed to compete if they can demonstrate they do not possess an unfair advantage over cis women. Fundamentally, Makar thinks that the goals of the trans community should not interfere with biological female sports. After all, sports has been something that has been segregated by sex for a long time now. But not for all of time, right? Title IX granted females additional protections as a protected class, right? But because there is a presumed difference between gender and sex now, just because somebody identifies as a woman doesn't mean that their biological advantages go out the window. So Makar wants to argue that sports should still be a sex-segregated space. This is what, in a sense, first-wave feminism was all about, was securing additional protections for females. So she actually advocates for new categories and events to be constructed that are inclusive of trans people. She doesn't think that women's sports should be thrown out or compromised just to accommodate the small percentage of people who transition into being a woman. And she actually makes a very interesting argument kind of at the end of the piece, which, I don't know, we'll see what you think about it. Because sports has always been segregated by sex, just as bathrooms used to be segregated by sex, she says that it's actually sexist to make females accommodate biological males in sports. She says that it's actually sexist and discriminatory towards women. In other words, forcing cis women to make way for biological males is sexist and discriminatory, she says. And let me just read one thing, and then we can finish by discussing everything that she's saying here. I'm on page 4, starting with the paragraph, "The argument is." The argument is that girls and women should step aside and make way for transgender athletes to compete in the girls and women's sports categories, considering the blatant discrimination they face. I say no. Girls and women shouldn't give up their hard-won sports opportunities, no matter how real the harms suffered by transgender athletes. Allowing transgender women to change the meaning of the women's category makes as much sense as allowing 180-pound athletes into the 120-pound weight category, because larger athletes were subject to awful bullying and harassment. Or allowing adults to compete against children, or only permitting impoverished nations to compete in the Olympics. Sport has been set up as a binary with males and females, and sport needs to adapt by adding new events and classifications rather than throwing out the meaning of the girls and women's categories. Rather than trying to squeeze transgender athletes into one of two categories, male or female, sport needs to adapt. I've now been an advocate for Title IX, the federal law requiring schools to prohibit sex discrimination, since the 1984 Olympics when I won my medals. As a civil rights lawyer, I run Champion Women, a nonprofit that provides legal advocacy for girls and women in sports. We produce data for athletes, families, alumni, and donors, which demonstrates just how badly 90% of colleges and universities are discriminating against women. In total, women are denied over 183,000 opportunities to play collegiate sports. They're denied over $1 billion in athletic scholarships and hundreds and millions of dollars in treatment, meaning women aren't being given equal facilities, locker rooms, medical care, publicity, travel, and so forth. I've never met a single female athlete that couldn't list the ways they're getting second-class treatment as compared to their male football or basketball players. In those 38 years, I've never heard a single man say, "Oh, you women face such overwhelming sex discrimination throughout society, particularly in sexual harassment and violence. Here, take our athletic facilities and scholarships." Quite the opposite. The unwritten rule is that women's sports can exist so long as not a single male is harmed by women's inclusion. And yet notice that women are expected to graciously move over and let trans athlete inclusion change the meaning of the women's sports category. It is sexist. We never allow the meaning of NCAA men's sports category to change so that current NFL and NBA teams could be included. We never allow 25-year-old men to compete in boys' high school events, and we would never tell those boys to just work harder if they wanted to win. I am ready to hear men's outrage. I am ready for men to step up and make sports equality happen for women's sports. Leah Thomas showed all of us that the current rules are not fair, and forcing her into the women's category only engenders resentment. That doesn't mean, however, that transgender athletes should be excluded from the many benefits of sport. Instead, sport must adapt in creative ways that are not harmful to the women's category. So what do you think about the argument she's making here? That women are actually experiencing sexism and discrimination in sport, and trans inclusion actually adds to that. And that it's unfair to women. Do you buy it? Do you think she's being dramatic? What do you think? For the women athletes in here, do you get the same money, same scholarships, have access to the same facilities and equipment that the boys do? If you do, how does that change after you graduate from college? If you were to be an athlete in the WNBA, how much would you get paid compared to your fellow classmates that might be in the NBA? I don't know, do you buy her overall argument here? You have a problem with it? Y'all completely agree with it? Yeah? No? Do you want to share your opinion?
I mean, I can see where she's coming from. This is what I'm saying. Like, sometimes it's okay to talk with people that don't have a certain point of view as you. I get where she's coming from, and I can understand certain aspects of her argument, but that last, forcing cis women to make way for biological males is sexist and discriminatory, or whatever you pronounce it. Can't pronounce words today. I don't agree with that last statement, only because in my personal opinion, and not everyone has to agree with this, because I know certain people have religious beliefs, political beliefs, whatever you want to believe in, but in my personal opinion, in my personal eyes, a trans woman is a woman and a trans man is a man, in my personal opinion. Not everyone has to think that way, but I just agree with that last part. For me personally, it isn't sexist. I mean, I don't play sports, so I can't speak on that, but it's just like, I don't think that's sexist or in any type of way discriminate, yeah, whatever that word is.
Okay.
I also feel like when someone transitions and becomes a trans woman, they're not only like getting that discrimination from being a woman, but also a trans woman. So it's kind of like not really at an advantage. If that makes sense.
Okay.
This is like regardless of like the sports, but
right.
I feel like that argument doesn't make any sense.
So you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not reflecting this back at you accurately, but you're saying that trans women face more oppression than women.
Yeah.
And that needs to be considered in this discussion.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody think she's right? I guess it would depend on what you think a woman is, right? Whether or not you think trans women are women. If you think, they belong in the same category, then no, this wouldn't be sexist, right? Because it's women asking other women to make way. But if you don't think they're the same, then you might think it is sexist, right? You see how that... Yeah.
Using this thought process, would Michael Phelps have an advantage over other male swimmers? Because he has a greater lung capacity. It's just like his thing. It's just his genetics. So should he be on his own league?
Right. I mean, the dude's got a swimmer's body, right? He's got a long wingspan. He's got greater lung capacity. He does seem to possess physical advantages over other men. Does that invalidate her argument?
I think it should be considered.
Different schools for different levels of people, how they are.
Okay. Yeah.
Like any type of people, women, men, people who are trans, they are gender what they say they are. So I would, again, like how other people said, trans women are women. So that argument is invalid. And
You don't think it's sexist?
No.
Okay.
It's kind of transphobic, actually, for them to say that.
Very fucking transphobic.
I just feel like people competing, like whether they be whoever, they earn those positions on the teams that they play if they're trying out for it anyways. So whoever's letting them on the team, it's their decision, So it's not really like, like they can play, but it's like, it's not like it's people making the decisions. It's again not these trans people are men or women, whatever. It's not their decision for people above them. So letting them on the team.
Right.
So it's not
Right.
their fault, and it's not that they're at an advantage. It's that they deserve to be on the team because of their physical abilities and the way that they perform.
Right. So if we buy for a moment that something needs to change, we might not lay the responsibility on trans people, right? Because it's the teams, or it's the coaches, or it's the people who make the rules that should adapt and change things. Maybe? Yeah?
I also don't think they should be separating those who are trans, because we, as like anyone, doesn't even need to know someone is trans unless they let us into their lives. So that's like, we don't have to know that they're trans. They're women, they're men, they're not like determined based on, oh, well, I was a biological male or I was a biological female, because they're men and women.
Okay.
There's also non-binary people, so where do they fit in each one?
Right. So that's why we made the distinction between sex and gender at the beginning, right? So as far as I know, non-binary is a gender identity. But then there are people also who are intersex. How do we handle those people when it comes to sports?
I mean, but when it comes to sports, like those people are gonna have an advantage that like transition from a male to a female in sports. It's not fair to the other females competing in that sport. That would be like having LeBron James transition to a female and then in 2.5 years he's playing in the WNBA. Like, what? Like, that's not fair at all.
It's like you're making the assumption that men are just transitioning to be in sports, and that's not the point. They're not doing that to be in sports.
No, I understand that. I was just saying, like, from a sports standpoint, like, from competing, there is clearly
Yeah,
a
but that's like the
disadvantage.
NCAA's as that. It's not those who are trans.
No, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Like, these people shouldn't be, like, targeted or, like, getting backlash from it, because it's not them that are making the rules. I totally get that. I'm just saying, like, when it comes to just the sports side of it, it's definitely, there's a disadvantage.
Okay. All right, I'll give you two the last word. You first.
Like, once the coach decides this is probably unfair, I know you're trans, but once you rejected her or him because of those reasons, think about how much backlash and how much hate they would get for that, like the school in general.
Okay. So maybe that's something that should be considered in the discussion. Is like, maybe there are incentives to be inclusive, because not being inclusive would be really bad for the team or the school, or maybe. Yeah.
Like the reason for transitioning, like regardless to the result, like it's not their fault that like they went transition, but like it's still an unfair advantage. So like it's not on them, but it's up to the league to like say like either they can't play or they can play in this way.
Okay. So she says that new events and categories should be constructed. It should be sport that adapts. Is that something that you all kind of agree with? Maybe the rules should be changed if you think, the rules are not proper. Okay. Well, I think we had a pretty good discussion today. Thank you for voicing your opinion. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great day. I'll see you on Thursday, okay?